Well, thank you, Nancy. At this time, let me dismiss those that were planning to go to Children's Church. I don't know about you, but I love a big event. I went to the David Jeremiah event, and there were 9,000 people or something like that gathered together for a time of worship and great music and encouragement in God's Word, and it's just an amazing time together, a big event. I love these times when we gather together as a church, as we come together and we focus. We're kind of in the same place, singing the same songs, doing the same things, and something about a big event. And this morning we're going to look at a big event. We're going to look at Elijah's big moment. But having said that, and I've talked about how important it is when we gather and the opportunities to meet with thousands of others and to enjoy those big events, let me tell you that it doesn't mean that they're the most important events. Really, even though this is Elijah's moment to address the nation, to confront the prophets of Baal, to have his big showdown, to get it all out in the open, I don't want to discount those years of living day to day, trusting God for his daily needs. I don't want to skip over those people who in that moment were available to Elijah, the widow and her son, who made many of those years, I'm sure, much more lively, much more enjoyable, or the work that Obadiah had been doing kind of silently all of those times, putting himself at risk in one moment, but at other times just seeking to do his best daily, even in the midst of the king's administration. And I don't want to forget that there's perhaps a greater work ahead for Elijah when in his ministry the time comes to pass the torch to a new prophet of God, and Elisha literally takes up the mantle of Elijah. And if you compare the stories, right, you can look at Elijah's life and what God does in Elijah, and you can see that in Elisha, God actually does twice as many, almost exactly, twice as many amazing moments. So when we come to this challenge today, I want you to not discount the time of preparation or the moments that are going to come, but I do want you to consider that perhaps the moment of challenge might be for you today, that this time, that this message comes to you and I in the reality of where we are, that it's your time today to take it for granted, to take it for your own use. The challenge that Elijah sets before his people in this moment. And to do that, you need to first kind of come to grips with some basic truths. The first one is this, that God is seeking his people, that he's at work, that he is active, that he is, aware of what's going on in your heart and in my life. Elijah sets up a meeting with the people of Israel. He forms in their minds a picture of God's heart that has something to say, and that's really the picture of the Bible. It's a God who interacts with his people. It begins at the very beginning of time when Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God. It's how God intends people to live. In a relationship, in an openness. It's the picture of Israel who God will not let walk away. Won't just let her make a choice and live with the complications of that choice. Even as Israel sins, God is pursuing here. Even though God is sending a drought, it's for a purpose. It's to bring her back. Even when Israel was killing God's prophets, God's plan wasn't ending. Really, even today for the nation of Israel, God's at work. A bottom line reality for Israel is that Israel belongs to God. The king, even King Ahab, was granted authority by God, even if he doesn't acknowledge it. The story begins this way. The confrontation takes its shape as Obadiah went to meet Ahab. And at the risk of his life, he tells Ahab to meet Elijah. And when Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah said, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." That's an amazing indictment. Not only have they abandoned the God who was at the heart of their existence, but they were following the false gods. They were taking the riches of God, his blessings on them, and were using them to worship an idol. Think about their story, right? Israel was part of those people that God had brought out of slavery in Egypt. Take them from a family of 70 to a people of 1 million. He brings them into the promised land and makes them a nation. He gives them a place and a prominence. He actively worked on their behalf. And God had a very special purpose for Israel. He was pursuing them because they belong to him. And in that pursuit, he's doing two things. First, he's exposing what they haven't done, the worship they haven't given to God, and the sins that they've committed, right? The idolatry in their hearts and lives. But it wasn't just true for Israel and for her sister Judah. The reality is that all people and all nations are God's. Today you sit here, and we sit here in America, and ultimately America, just as Franklin Graham comes to ask prayer for the nation because God's pursuing our nation and our hearts. Listen to what Paul wrote to the church in Colossae. He said, "For in God, for in him, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him." The shape of our present world, the shape of the condition of our hearts, the place where you're at today is a place that God has made. And ultimately, you're responsible to him. But in the story of the Bible, in the story of Elijah, the sense is that it's God that's the active partner. He's the one that's pursuing the relationship. We've seen it. We talked about it in Elijah's story. God is pursuing those people of Israel. Even in their wandering days, God has been at work, working in the lives of his servants, in the heart and life of his prophet, in the circumstances of his servants, softening the hearts of his people for this moment in the time of famine. God wants to be found. And he goes out offering himself, making himself available. Remember what Jeremiah said? He's speaking for the Lord. He said, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." That's what's going on in these days. God is pursuing that relationship, inviting people to seek him, giving them evidence and reason to come to him. And Elijah issues the invitation this way. He says to King Ahab, "Summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. So the king and the people, right? The whole nation gathers there. He invites representatives to come. I don't have any idea what the audience was, but it would have been sizable. People would have heard about the confrontation. Ahab has been hunting for Elijah all these years. He has been determined to find him and take his life. And now the people hear that he has come, and there's going to be this big confrontation. Elijah invites the audience, and he brings together the prophets, the false prophets, and expose the competition. I'm not much for confrontation. I would really like things just to be kind of peaceful, to go along, to get along, and just be kind of normal for me. I remember some years ago that a lady was attended our church out in Colorado and was also attending another church, and this other church was, I'm not even telling you the title of the church, but just even the name of the church, kind of sent hackles up the back of my neck. And so she decided it would be a good idea to get the pastors together and decide who was right and who was wrong from these two Christian traditions. And so she invited me to meet her for breakfast, but she didn't tell me she'd invited this other pastor to come for breakfast too. And so I show up, and here's this other guy, and he introduces himself, and right away, he was out to prove that I was wrong. It was all, the point of contention was about baptism. And he said that you had to be baptized to be saved. And I was saying, really, baptism, I think, serves as a picture of salvation rather than a way that salvation is provided. And she wanted us to figure out who was right there at that breakfast table. And really, once I figured out what was going on, I said, look, I don't want to tear down this guy's work. I don't want to turn him away from a heart to serve the Lord in the way that God has for him. I don't want to fight this fight over French toast, right? But it can be a really entertaining thing to watch for someone to do it. And at this moment, I think that's what the people of Israel came to see, was kind of a showdown. But maybe initially they missed what God was trying to do in their hearts. God was not just trying to answer the question of who's God, and yes, that question gets answered, but God was demonstrating his pursuit of his people. A couple of weeks ago in our men's Bible study, as we made our way through the Psalms, we came to Psalm chapter 23, right? Really famous. And the psalm in that moment ends with that fifth verse, that phrase, surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. And in our discussion, it came up that idea of following isn't like a parade, really. He's not following us in that way where like he's in back kind of cleaning up behind us. Rather, the following comes with this idea of God pursuing us. As we thought about that, I thought, we just need to stop running. You need to stop running. You need to let goodness and love catch you. You need to come to learn to trust them, and that's what's going on. That's what's going on here in Mount Carmel. The people have got to decide if they're going to let God finally get hold of them. Are they going to let his pursuit of them come to a meeting place? Elijah brings Israel together. He brings them to a moment in the hopes that they will stop running, that they will stop all of their sinning distractions. Today, is there a sense in your heart that in some way or another, God's pursuing you? That there is an issue that he wants to bring to kind of a conclusion, that there's an invitation he's issued that he wants you to respond to, that there's a moment where you're at now, where you're aware that God wants your attention and your heart. But there's something complicating your response, isn't there? Elijah's challenge includes that same kind of thing. Not only is God's pursuit important to know, but we need to respond to God's, conviction of our sin, of where we really are. Elijah confronts the nation of Israel with the reality of their situation. He goes before the people and he says, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. How long will you waver between two opinions? Clearly, they were worshiping idols. They were wavering. They were paralyzed by indecision, for a while they'd worship God, and then they'd go back and they'd worship Baal and back and forth. I don't think they stopped worshiping God. They just added the idols. But the reality is that God and anything else is idolatry. God's opinion and someone else's opinion. If you weigh them both the same, that's idolatry. Loving God and yet loving what someone else thinks more, that's idolatry. Loving God and your freedom to engage in some other activity, idolatry. All through the Old Testament. Beginning right there in the Ten Commandments, it's pictured that God is a jealous God. Do you remember that? He talks about not making any images or idols, and he said, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." God designed us to run with him in first place, to hear his voice above every other voice, to listen to what he says before any other information. He's a jealous God because he knows us. He loves us. He has designed us for himself. And Jesus picks up that same kind of theme, and he quotes from the Old Testament, from the book of Deuteronomy. And in the New Testament, in response to conversations about honoring God and keeping God, he takes the commandments, he packages them all together, and he says, the greatest commandment is this: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. To love him most. Anything less is idolatry. It's a convicting word, isn't it? What really has more influence? What do you care about more than what God thinks? Whose word moves you before God's does? For them, in this moment, they didn't want to make that commitment. Did you catch that little phrase? And the people said nothing. They weren't quite there. They weren't quite ready. They didn't want to commit to God. They enjoyed the comfort of being God's people. They loved all the tradition and the ceremony. They loved celebrating the history, but there was a sense that while they enjoyed the activity, they weren't willing to give God all of the place that he wanted in their life. They said nothing. They were unwilling to abandon the worship of Baal. They wanted to do both. If you and I would think back to the struggles in our own lives, we would come to admit probably something that was true for them also, and that is simply that they enjoyed their sin. There's no doubt about it, right? We sin because we want to. You sin because you want to. We know it's wrong. We know that attitude, that action. We know that snarky little comment or that temptation on the computer. All of those things are sin, and yet we want that. Hebrews talks about the example of Moses, and says this about him, that he refused to be known as Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. They may be fleeting, but it doesn't mean we don't think about them as fun. We know the things that we shouldn't do. We still do them because they seem so attractive. Several times I've talked about Baal worship as a fertility cult. And as part of their worship, there was feasting and drinking and sex, right? And who doesn't like those things? But those are like the top 3 activities of mankind for all of history. It was popular in the region. It was safe. It made you look good in the eyes of the king and queen. The people in power liked it when you participated. Gave people a sense of control over their lives. They would do these things and then things would go well for them. A little bit harder to live in trust of Yahweh, to live in trust of the God of their fathers, because that required faith. It required taking what God had said and being willing to believe it to be true rather than, kind kind of a, if you do this, God will do that kind of idolatry. Later, as the church would develop, different churches would grow and struggle with this whole idea of idolatry and with what it looked like and how much sin you can get away with before you make God mad enough that you have to change. The church of Laodicea, one of those letters that was written in the Old Testament, to that church, God sent this message. He said, I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. And I wish you were either one, because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold. I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. They wanted to combine their worship of this world, those things that won their heart, with their Christian worship, and it didn't work. Laodicea was an interesting city. It was a wealthy city, but their one downfall was that they were a long ways away from their water source. To bring water into the city, they brought this very long aqueduct down from the mountains across a valley into their city. But the aqueduct was so long that the sun would warm the water up to a tepid level. By the time it got to their city, it was neither hot nor cold. It was lukewarm. Sometimes that's what causes us to enjoy our sin. Keeps us from God's conviction reaching in and bringing change in our hearts, that distance that we feel from God. The things we put in our minds that hold God at a distance, that keeps His voice from applying to us, it distracts us from what God has clearly told us. Change. Change begins with an awareness of what's wrong. And God begins to put His hand and expose our hearts. In the midst of marriage counseling, I often talk to the parents about dealing with, to the couple, about dealing with conflict. And when they realize that what they've done or what they've said really has hurt their spouse, I try and teach them to say 3 simple things to their spouse. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. If it's been a while since you've used that in your marriage relationship, you might want to write those down. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And you need to say those things honestly, sincerely, and simply in the appropriate times. Seeking and granting forgiveness is an amazing part of a relationship. So in this moment, Elijah brings the people of Israel to that place where hopefully they come to realize those 3 things. They come to realize that they are wrong. They begin to experience the reality that they're sorry about where they are and come seek God's face for His forgiveness. Elijah moves them toward that process. And he says to them, I am only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bowls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. And I will prepare the other bowl and put it on